In the dusty plains where the sun beats down mercilessly and the wind whispers ancient secrets, a lonely rancher made a decision that would shake the entire community. Without heirs and with the weight of years on his calloused back, he bought a young orphan girl to work on his land. What happened next transformed not just two lives, but the destiny of an entire region where hope seemed as scarce as water. At the break of dawn, when the wind whispered forgotten promises across the dunes and the first ray of sun touched the parched earth, like a divine finger probing old wounds, the fate of two souls was about to intertwine, irreversibly. The Morrison Ranch stood solitary, against the infinite horizon, its wooden fences creaking like old bones under the weight of time. It was there, on that stubborn piece of land that resisted as much as its owner, that a story of transformation was about to be born. Thomas Morrison was a man forged by the relentless sun, and the losses life had mercilessly imposed upon him. At 43, his eyes held the depth of dry wells where hope had once flowed, but they also maintained the sharp vigilance of a lone wolf who had learned to survive without a pack. His hands, marked by old calluses and scars from battles against the land and against himself, knew every stone, every root, every secret of that ungrateful soil. He was the last of his line, a dry branch on a family tree that had once bloomed with laughter and promises of continuity. The morning everything changed arrived dressed in normalcy, but destiny has peculiar ways of announcing its turning points. A dust-covered carriage appeared on the horizon, its horses panting as if they had crossed hell itself. The coachman, a man with a face weathered by time, carried documents and a passenger who would forever change the emotional landscape of that God-forsaken place. Clara had no last name. At 19, she was a natural survivor, shaped by early losses and the relentless need to keep breathing in a world that seemed determined to suffocate her. Her eyes, a deep brown like the earth after a rare rain, held secrets and a determination that burned like embers hidden beneath cold ashes. The St. Louis orphanage had prepared her for hard work, but not for what she would find on that isolated ranch where the silence screamed louder than any crowd. The first encounter between them was marked by an incident that would set the tone for their relationship. The carriage, already wobbly after days of travel over hostile trails, gave out 2 leagues, approximately 6 miles, from the ranch. The rear axle snapped with a crack that echoed across the plains like a shot of mercy. Clara, thrown out with the meager baggage that constituted all her earthly possessions, found herself under the midday sun that beat like a blacksmith's hammer on the desert's anvil. That's how Thomas found her. He wasn't looking for anything more than a stray calf when he spotted the small figure trying to lift the broken carriage with her bare hands. The desperate determination in her gesture touched something within him, a chord long silenced. He approached on his horse, the shadow of the animal and the man falling over her like an unexpected blessing. The water he offered from his canteen was not just vital liquid. It was the first gesture in a complex dance between 2 wounded souls who didn't yet know they needed each other to heal. Clara drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his, measuring, assessing, looking for signs of danger or kindness in that time-worn face. The silence between them spoke volumes. Thomas was not a man of many words, and Clara had learned that silence was often safer than any conversation. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried the roughness of dust and the firmness of rock. He simply said that the ranch was ahead and that she could rest there until the carriage was repaired. The coachman, recovering from the shock, quickly explained the situation. The papers he carried formalized a 7-year labor contract. Clara had been hired as a worker for the Morrison Ranch, a legal arrangement common for orphans without resources, but one that still caused whispers and sidelong glances in a society that walked hesitantly between the old and new worlds. The community of Agua Fria, the nearest town 3 days' ride away, would receive the news like a bolt from the blue. A lonely rancher buying a young orphan girl was not something that went unnoticed, where every life was known and dissected like the carcasses vultures left on the plains. The Morrison Ranch revealed itself to Clara's eyes as a fortress of solitude. The main house, built with wood and stone, rested from that unforgiving land, stood with tired dignity. The barn, the corrals, every structure told the story of a man who had built a small but solid empire with his own hands, only to find he had no one to leave it to. In the first few days, tension hung between them like the dust that never quite settled. Thomas assigned Clara a small but clean room in the back of the house, an unusual concession for a hired worker. Most slept in the barn or in separate shacks. But something in that young woman's gaze, perhaps a wounded but not broken pride, made him break his own protocols. The work was hard. Clara discovered muscles she didn't know she possessed as she learned to handle cattle, mend fences, carry hay bales that seemed to weigh as much as her own memories. Thomas watched from afar, correcting when necessary, but mostly letting her find her own rhythm. It was like taming a wild horse, he thought. You need patience and respect for the untamed spirit. It was on a particularly scorching afternoon that the first moment of true connection happened. Clara had spent hours trying to fix a stubborn water pump that refused to work. Sweat streamed down her face. Her hands already showed the first signs of blisters, but she didn't give up. Thomas approached silently, as was his custom, and without a word knelt beside her. Together, in silence, they worked on the jammed mechanism. His experienced hands guided hers, inexperienced but determined. When the water finally gushed forth, clear and precious like liquid diamonds, a smile escaped Clara's lips. It was brief, but Thomas captured it like someone finding a gold nugget by chance. That night, he left a book on her table. Not just any book, but a worn volume of poetry and stories that had belonged to his mother. Clara found it upon returning. From her solitary dinner in the kitchen, the pages yellowed by time, but the words still alive and pulsing. It was more than a gift. It was permission to dream, an acknowledgement that she was more than muscle and sweat. The community began to talk. On his rare visits to the town to buy supplies, Thomas heard the whispers. Some, like old Mrs. Martinez, who ran the general store, saw it favorably. After all, a man needs help and a girl needs work. Others, like Samuel Thornton, the rancher, on the neighboring land, saw it with different eyes. Eyes that coveted Morrison's land as much as they questioned the morality of the arrangement. Thornton was a snake in respectable clothing. His lands, though vast, suffered from poor management and a greed that dried up wells faster than any sun. For years he had coveted Morrison's land, especially access to the dry river, which, despite its name, maintained a trickle of water even in the worst droughts. The first weeks turned into months. Clara revealed unexpected talents. Her hands, which initially fumbled with the simplest tasks, showed surprising skill with medicinal herbs. She knew plants that Thomas considered just weeds, transforming them into poultices and teas that healed everything from headaches to infected wounds. It was this skill that triggered the second crucial moment in their relationship. Lightning, Thomas's favorite horse, suddenly fell ill. The animal, a black stallion like a moonless night, refused food and water, its eyes losing their vital spark. Thomas, who rarely showed emotion, was visibly shaken. That horse was more than an animal. It was a companion, a survivor like him. Clara spent 3 nights by the animal's side. Her small hands prepared infusions, massaged tense muscles, whispered words of comfort that seemed to reach the animal's soul. Thomas stayed nearby, pretending to check on other chores, but always returning to the barn, where she kept vigil. On the third dawn, Lightning stood up. Trembling at first, but soon steady, the horse neighed softly and accepted water from Clara's, and Thomas, who had fallen asleep leaning against a hay bale, awoke to the sound. The look they exchanged in that moment, illuminated only by the weak lantern, was the first real acknowledgement that something had changed between them. The dry season arrived like a relentless invader. What was once hard earth became fine dust that seeped through every crack, covering everything with a film of hopelessness. Water, always precious, became more valuable than gold. The wells began to show signs of depletion, and tension in the region grew like the cracks in the parched earth. It was then that Thomas discovered the betrayal. The waters of the dry river, which should have flowed partially through his land, were being diverted. Makeshift dams, built overnight like thieves' work, stole the precious liquid before it reached the Morrison lands. The footprints led inevitably to Thornton's land. Thomas's anger burned silently but intensely. Like the embers Clara kept alive under the ashes, his first instinct was to grab his rifle and settle the matter the way men of his generation learned, to settle disputes. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was Clara's worried look when she saw him check the weapons, or perhaps it was the subtle change that had been occurring in his own heart. Instead, he chose the path of the law. He rode to the town, Clara insisting on accompanying him despite his protests. The 3-day journey under the relentless sun was a test of endurance, but also an opportunity. During rest stops, they talked. Small revelations emerged, like flowers in the desert after a rare rain. Clara told him about the fire that took her parents when she was only 7. How the smell of smoke still made her wake up in a panic. How she learned to read hidden in the orphanage, stealing moments with discarded books. Thomas, in turn, spoke about the wife he lost in childbirth, taking with her the son who would have been his heir. How for years he blamed God, the land himself. On the night of the second stop, camped under a sky so vast it seemed to crush with its infinitude, Clara asked why he had hired her. Thomas's answer came after a long silence, the words struggling to come out like water from a nearly dry well. He said there was something in her eyes the day he found her on the road, a refusal to surrender that he recognized, because it was the same one that kept him standing every morning. The sheriff in Agua Fria was a fair but tired man. Jake Woodward had seen too much of human nature to hold on to illusions, but he still believed in the law as the last bastion between civilization and chaos. He listened to Thomas's complaint, examined the evidence, but warned that without concrete proof it would be difficult to act against Thornton, a man with connections and money. It was Clara who suggested looking in the town's old records. Her experience in the orphanage, where she had learned to navigate bureaucracy to get the bare minimum, proved valuable. Together, she and Thomas spent days in the small courthouse library, breathing in decades of dust and forgotten stories. The discovery came like a ray of hope. An old map, dated from the town's founding, showed not only the original water rights but also the existence of an underground aquifer marked by a prospector 50 years earlier but never explored. The location was on Morrison land, in a rocky area considered unproductive. The journey back was different. There was now a shared purpose, a tangible hope, but there was also something more, subtle like the wind changing direction before a storm. Gazes lingered a little longer. Silences were comfortable instead of tense, and when Clara stumbled on a steep descent, Thomas's hand was there, firm and protective. Excavation work began immediately. Thomas hired 2 men from the town, trustworthy, veterans who knew as much about rocks as they did about loyalty. The area indicated on the map was indeed inhospitable, a jumble of rocks and thorny bushes that seemed to guard their secrets with tooth and nail. Days passed, already calloused. Hands gained new injuries. Hope began to falter like a flame in the wind when one of the men's pickaxes produced a different sound. Not the dull thud against solid rock, but a hollow echo that spoke of empty spaces. Excitement swept through the group like a fever. Clara was the first to see the water when they finally broke through the last layer of rock. Crystalline and abundant, it gushed from an underground source as if it had waited half a century for that moment. Her cries of joy echoed through the hills, and Thomas, usually reserved, let out a smile that transformed his face, like the sun transforms the landscape after a storm. But Thornton was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. News of the water discovery on Morrison land spread like fire in dry grass. For a man whose greed had dried up not only wells, but also any trace of humanity, this was intolerable. The first signs of trouble came subtly. Fences cut during the night scattered cattle. Small acts of sabotage that could be attributed to vandals or wild animals. Thomas increased vigilance, but with just him, Clara, and the 2 workers, it was impossible to guard the entire perimeter of the ranch. It was on an afternoon when the sky took on shades of copper and bronze, foreshadowing a storm, that Clara made a disturbing discovery. Following the tracks of some stray cattle, she found evidence of a recent camp. Remnants of a campfire, footprints of several men, and more disturbingly, empty rifle cartridges. She ran back to the ranch, her heart pounding like 1,000 wild horses' hooves. Thomas was in the barn, preparing for the afternoon milking. Upon hearing her account, his face took on the hardness of granite. He knew Thornton's methods, knew the man was escalating his tactics. That night, as the wind howled promises of violence, they prepared their defenses. The two workers were sent to the town, ostensibly to get supplies, but in truth to alert the sheriff. Thomas and Clara remained, a decision she insisted on making despite his protests. The storm arrived with the fury of a maddened titan. It wasn't just wind and dust. It was a solid wall of sand that turned day into night and made every breath a battle. Visibility dropped to zero, sounds distorted by the incessant howling of nature in fury. It was at the height of the chaos that the attack came, shadowy figures emerging from the curtain of dust like demons from hell itself. The barn was the first target, torches thrown despite the wind trying to extinguish the flames as soon as they were born. Thomas ran to fight the fire, leaving Clara in the house with a rifle she barely knew how to handle. The fight was desperate. Thomas, divided between fighting the flames and repelling the invaders, soon found himself outnumbered. A blow from a rifle butt knocked him down, blood mixing with the dust on his face. It was then that Clara acted, not with the rifle, which her hands trembled too much to aim, but with the cunning born of survival. She knew every corner of the ranch after months of working there. Using the storm as an ally, she moved like a ghost between the structures. The old well, nearly dry but with a 30-foot drop, became a trap. Shouts and taunts lured pursuers into the darkness, where the ground gave way under their feet. But it was her boldest move that changed the course of the battle. A group of travelers, merchants she had noticed camped half a league, approximately 1.5 miles away that morning, could be her salvation. Risking everything, she mounted Lightning and galloped through the storm, the horse trusting her as she had trusted him during his illness. The merchants, rough but honest men, did not hesitate to help. The arrival of reinforcements, even if only 5 armed men, was enough to turn the tide. Thornton's henchmen, cowards when confronted with real resistance, scattered into the storm like rats. Clara found Thomas lying near the partially burned barn. The cut on his head was bleeding profusely, but he was conscious. Seeing her, he tried to speak, but she silenced him with a gesture. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she dragged him to the safety of the house while the merchants pursued the last invaders. In that kitchen, lit only by candles as the storm raged outside, something fundamental changed. As Clara cleaned his wounds with hands that had finally stopped trembling, Thomas held her wrist. His eyes, usually hard as stone, showed a vulnerability he had buried with his wife years ago. The words he spoke were simple, but as heavy as storm. Clouds. He thanked her not just for saving his life, but for bringing life back to the ranch, to him. Clara, whose own defenses had been broken down by the intensity of the moment, allowed a tear to escape. It was the first she had shed since the day she left the orphanage. Morning revealed the extent of the damage and the changes. The barn was partially destroyed, some cattle lost, but the ranch remained. More importantly, Thornton had been captured by the merchants when he tried to flee. In his desperation, he confessed his crimes, including the water diversion and the attack on the Morrison Ranch. Sheriff Woodward arrived at noon with a posse. Thornton's arrest was swift and definitive, but more significant was what happened next to neighbors, many of whom had kept their distance from the arrangement between Thomas and Clara, began to show up. They brought tools, materials, hands willing to help with the reconstruction. Mrs. Martinez was one of the first, her wagon loaded with provisions and her wrinkled face showing a knowing smile. As she handed a basket of fresh bread to Clara, she whispered that it was about time Thomas found someone who matched his stubbornness. Clara blushed, but did not deny what was blossoming between them. The reconstruction became a community event. Men who had been just distant acquaintances worked side by side with Thomas. Women who had whispered about the propriety of the arrangement now talked with Clara about recipes and home remedies. The Morrison Ranch, for so long an island of isolation, was becoming part of the community fabric. It was during this reconstruction that the third crucial moment between Thomas and Clara happened. They were working late. The others had already left when they found a box among the barn's debris. Inside, photographs and letters Thomas thought lost. Images of his wife, letters from his long-departed family. Thomas held a photograph with trembling hands. Clara, respecting his grief, began to move away, but he stopped her. In a hoarse voice, he shared memories he had locked away with the images. He spoke about shattered dreams, about the fear of building new ones. Clara listened, her presence a silent balm. When he finished, silence hung heavy, but not uncomfortable. Clara then shared her own box of invisible memories. She spoke about the parents she barely remembered, about nights in the orphanage dreaming of a place to belong, about the constant fear that any happiness would be temporary. Their hands met on the dusty table between the photographs of the past and the tools of the future. There were no dramatic declarations, just the mutual understanding of two souls who had found in each other a safe harbor amidst life's storms. The following months brought a normality that was, in itself, extraordinary. Water from the new source transformed parts of the ranch. Where before there was only survival, now there was the possibility of prosperity. Clara, with Thomas's support, started a medicinal herb garden that soon attracted interest from the entire town. The fourth crucial moment came unexpectedly. A lawyer from the East arrived looking for Clara. She had inherited a small sum from a distant relative who had prospered in California. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to buy freedom, to start somewhere else if she wanted. Thomas received the news like a physical blow. For days he avoided her, immersing himself in work as if he could drown his fear in daily tasks. Clara, in turn, carried the lawyer's papers as if they were live coals. The freedom she had always dreamed of was within reach, but she discovered that the chains that bound her now were of a different nature. It was on a night of full moon, when the plain seemed bathed in liquid silver, that the confrontation happened. Clara found Thomas sitting on the porch, looking at the horizon as if he could find answers in the stars. Without preamble, she placed the papers on his lap. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult they had ever had. Thomas, his voice choked with emotion, said he wouldn't hold her back, that she deserved more than a dusty ranch and a man marked by the past. Clara, with a mixture of frustration and tenderness, asked when he would understand that she wasn't, held back, but choosing to stay. The kiss they shared then was the first real one. Not an accidental brush of lips or a gesture of comfort, but a declaration of intent, a promise sealed under the testimony of the indifferent stars. The lawyer's papers were forgotten, eventually serving to light the fire on a cold morning. Spring arrived like a shy bride, bringing rains that transformed the desert into a temporary miracle of colors. Flowers that had slept underground for years awakened, painting the landscape with hues Thomas swore he had never seen before. Or perhaps, he admitted to himself, he simply hadn't been looking. Preparations for the wedding were simple but meaningful. There would be no grand ceremony, just a gathering in the small-town chapel with those who had become more than neighbors. Clara would wear Thomas's mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk he now opened without the searing pain of before. But destiny, as always, had one more card to play. A week before the planned wedding, news arrived that a band of outlaws was terrorizing the region. Led by a man known only as Black Wolf, they left a trail of destruction wherever they went. Sheriff Woodward organized a militia, and Thomas, as a capable and respected man, was called upon. Clara protested, the icy fear of losing what she had found clenching her heart like an iron fist. But both knew he couldn't refuse. The community that had welcomed them needed protection. The farewell was difficult. In the corral, as Thomas prepared lightning, Clara approached with something in her hands. It was a braided leather band, intertwined, with strands of her own hair and protective herbs. A charm, she said, to bring him back. Thomas tied it to his wrist, the gesture solemn as an oath. The days that followed were the longest of Clara's life. She kept the ranch running with the help of the workers, but her eyes constantly searched the horizon. The nights were worse. Every sound potentially the return of the militia or terrible news. It was on an evening stained blood red that the vigil ended. Figures appeared on the road, moving slowly. Clara ran, her heart in her throat, recognizing lightning even from a distance. But something was wrong. Thomas was leaning on the saddle, other men supporting him. The confrontation with the outlaws had been violent. Black Wolf was dead, his band scattered, but the price had been high. Thomas had been shot in the shoulder, the bullet lodged dangerously close to vital arteries. The town doctor, summoned in haste, was pessimistic. Clara took control with steely determination. Her skills with herbs, combined with tireless care, did what the doctor considered improbable. For days and nights she stayed by Thomas's side, fighting the fever, changing bandages, whispering prayers and threats that he shouldn't dare leave her. The moment he opened his eyes, lucid for the first time in a week, coincided with the sunrise. Golden light filled the room like a divine blessing. Clara, exhausted beyond description, then cried all the tears she had held back. Thomas, weak but alive, used his limited strength to wipe those tears away. Recovery was slow but steady. The wedding, postponed out of necessity, finally happened on a summer day when Thomas could stand without support. It was even simpler than originally planned, but loaded with meaning that transcended any elaborate ceremony. Sheriff Woodward officiated, his voice choked with emotion seeing two survivors find peace in each other. Mrs. Martinez wept openly, declaring to everyone that she had always known it would work out. The merchants who had helped on the night of the storm traveled specially for the occasion, bringing practical gifts and sincere wishes. But the most touching moment was when Thomas, still recovering his strength, insisted on dancing with Clara. To the sound of a slightly out of tune but enthusiastically played fiddle, they moved slowly in the makeshift hall. For those watching, it was more than a dance. It was a declaration of victory over all the adversities they had faced. Married life brought new and familiar challenges. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Clara expanded her medicinal garden, soon supplying remedies for the entire county. Thomas, with his arm still recovering, learned to delegate, to trust others besides himself. The fifth and final crucial moment of their romance came silently on an ordinary morning. Clara had been feeling nauseous for days, attributing it to the summer heat and overwork. It was Mrs. Martinez, on one of her frequent visits, who suggested with a knowing smile that perhaps there was another explanation. Confirmation came through the town doctor, the same one who had doubted Thomas's recovery. Clara was pregnant. The news hit Thomas like lightning, but this time of pure joy mixed with terror. At 44, he would have another chance at fatherhood. The following months were filled with careful preparation. The room that had been Clara's when she arrived was transformed into a nursery. Thomas, whose hands only knew the hardness of working with cattle and land, learned to work wood with delicacy, creating a cradle that was a labor of love. Clara remained strong, adapting her work to the new reality. The women of the town, previously distant, now surrounded her with advice and care. It was as if the coming baby belonged not just to the Morrison couple, but to the entire community that had witnessed their improbable love story. Labor began on a stormy night, as if nature insisted on marking the crucial moments of their lives with meteorological drama. But this time, they were not alone. The midwife arrived in time, the neighbors organized to help, and Thomas, banished from the room as was tradition, paced like a caged lion. Clara's cries cut through the walls, each one a dagger in Thomas's heart. He, who had faced outlaws and storms with stoicism, found himself reduced to desperate prayers. The leather band on his wrist, the charm Clara had made, was squeezed as if it could transfer strength through contact. The baby's cry came with the first light of morning, strong and indignant as befits a child of the desert. Thomas was finally admitted to the room to find Clara exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle. "A boy," the midwife announced with satisfaction, "healthy as a new foal for a baby." The moment Thomas held his son for the first time was one of complete transformation. The hard man who had built walls around his heart saw them crumble completely. Tears, strange on his sun-weathered face, fell onto the little face that already showed the familiar Morrison chin's stubbornness. They named him William, in honor of Clara's father, whom she had barely known. But soon he became simply Will, a name that carried will and determination, qualities he would surely need as a son of that harsh but beautiful land. Life on the ranch took on new rhythms. Will's crying punctuated the days, turning work into intervals between feedings and lullabies. Clara found she could rock her son while checking on her herbs, and Thomas became a master at soothing the baby while mending harnesses. Will's baptism was another community event. The small chapel overflowed with neighbors and friends. Even passing travelers stopped to witness, drawn by the story of the lonely rancher and the orphan girl who had found love and created new life amidst the harshness of the desert. Years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Will grew up strong and curious, a perfect blend of his father's quiet determination and his mother's lively intelligence. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the region. But more than material success, they had built something rare, a true home. Clara established a small clinic where she treated the body's ailments with her herbs and the soul's ailments with her understanding. Women came from far and wide seeking her remedies and advice. Thomas, his hair, now more salt and pepper, hair, had become a respected patriarchal figure, consulted in community disputes and decisions. One afternoon, watching Will play in the same corral where they had worked side by side years before, Clara asked Thomas if he had imagined life would take this turn when he signed those papers at the courthouse years ago. Thomas, with his arm around her, replied that he hadn't. He had only expected help for the ranch. He had received an entire universe. The sunset painted the sky with the same colors as that fateful afternoon when they first met. But now, instead of solitude and despair, there was fullness and peace. The wind still whispered among the cacti, but its stories had changed. They spoke now of improbable love, of quiet courage, of how two lost souls had found each other and built something beautiful amidst the hardship. The Morrison Ranch remained as a testament that life's greatest shocks are often the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be. The community that had whispered scandalously about the rancher buying an orphan girl now told the story as a legend of hope. Proof that in the most arid desert, with care and determination, love can bloom, like the rare flowers that emerge after the rain. Clara sometimes found the old labor contract kept among the important papers. 7 years of service, the document said. She smiled, knowing she had signed up for much more than that. She had signed up for a lifetime, and she didn't regret a single day. Thomas, looking at his family gathered around the dinner table, the sound of laughter filling the house that had once echoed only silence, knew he had received infinitely more than he had given. The solitude that defined him had been replaced by connection, fear by trust, emptiness by abundance. And so, in the plains where the sun still beats down mercilessly and the wind still carries ancient secrets, the story of an improbable love continues to inspire, reminding everyone that the moments that shock us, that take us off the beaten path, are often the ones that lead us to our true destiny. And you, when will you let hope bloom in your desert?